Carlos de la Cruz was a man whose life was defined by honesty, hard work, and a deep sense of loyalty to his family. A businessman who rose from humble beginnings, he started his own import-export company, painstakingly built it from the ground up, and earned a reputation for being fair and trustworthy. He was beloved by his family, respected by his employees, and admired by his community. But it was his relationship with his only son, Charles, that defined him most. Carlos was a devoted father, pouring his energy into shaping Charles's future with the same values and strength he'd always lived by. Charles grew up admiring his father's dedication, his patience, and the sheer resilience Carlos displayed even when times were tough. Carlos always instilled in Charles the belief that life was about choices, that one could always choose to do right, even when wrong seemed easier. To Charles, his father was not just a man. He was an anchor, a mentor, and an unwavering source of strength and kindness. Their bond was strong, a connection built on trust, love, and admiration. Yet life's unpredictable nature would soon shatter this peace. Little did Charles know that the strength his father instilled in him would later serve as both a weapon and a curse, a force that would drive him to acts he once would never have imagined. Carlos's business was modest but profitable. He focused on importing rare and exotic goods, often traveling across countries to secure unique items. Though he made a good living, his success also caught the attention of local criminals, men who sought an easy profit by manipulating or extorting those who had worked hard for their fortunes. Carlos had managed to evade these threats, staying beneath the radar of any real danger for years. But one day, everything changed. Carlos received an uninvited visit from a local criminal group led by a man named Miguel "Mick" Rios, a ruthless man who viewed people like Carlos as nothing more than stepping stones to his own prosperity. Mick and his men had heard of Carlos's success, and they were intent on collecting a tax, a sum of money that Carlos would be forced to pay regularly for supposed protection from other criminals. Carlos, principled and brave, refused. He explained calmly that he wouldn't pay a single penny for something he didn't believe in and that he wasn't afraid of Mick or his men. To him, the very idea of extortion was repulsive, a direct contradiction to everything he believed in and had worked for. Mick, however, was not a man to be dismissed so easily. Late one evening, while Carlos was working late at his small warehouse office, Mick and his 4 men came for him. They intended to scare him into submission, to make him realize the mistake he'd made by refusing their offer. But what began as intimidation quickly spiraled out of control. Carlos, fearless even in the face of danger, didn't flinch. He refused to bow down, shouting defiantly that he'd never be coerced into anything against his will. Infuriated by Carlos's resistance, Mick ordered his men to make an example of him. The beating was relentless and brutal. It went beyond what even Mick had planned. But by the time they realized what they'd done, Carlos's lifeless body lay crumpled on the cold warehouse floor, a man's pride and strength crushed by ruthless men who knew only violence. They fled, leaving Carlos behind without a second thought. When Charles was informed of his father's death, the news shattered his world. He was only 17, a young man still growing, still learning. His father was his hero, and now that hero was gone, brutally taken from him by forces he couldn't understand. The grief was immense, consuming him like a wildfire. But alongside that grief came another feeling, a darker, more insidious emotion, anger. It wasn't just the loss of his father that hurt, it was the way he was taken. The knowledge that men had chosen to take his father's life, not for any reason beyond greed and power, left Charles with a burning fury that he struggled to contain. The thought of his father's face, once full of life and warmth, now gone forever, haunted him day and night. Charles promised himself he'd find out who did this. He vowed that one day, somehow, he would make those responsible pay for their actions. The years that followed were hard. Charles took up his father's business, determined to keep his legacy alive. But it was a heavy burden to carry. He was haunted by the memories of his father, by the principles Carlos had taught him. Though he desperately wanted to honor his father's teachings, his anger and bitterness festered beneath the surface, feeding a darker part of him. Every corner of the business reminded him of Carlos. Every interaction with an old colleague, every piece of paperwork he filed, and every client he spoke to was a painful reminder of the man he'd lost. He was no longer just Charles, a young man learning the ropes. He was now Charles, the avenger, haunted by the ghost of his father and driven by a sense of duty to bring justice to his family. As he grew older, Charles's demeanor changed. He was no longer the bright, hopeful son his father had once raised. He became cold, reserved, almost ruthless in his determination. To the outside world, he was a quiet, diligent businessman. But within him lay a storm, a growing rage that drove him to spend sleepless nights plotting, planning, and preparing for the day he would meet his father's killers. By the time Charles reached his late 20s, he was a man transformed. Gone was the open, trusting young man his father had raised, replaced by someone colder, calculating, and driven by a singular purpose. Charles had spent years not only grieving but meticulously preparing. In the privacy of his own mind, he had constructed a mental map of revenge, piecing together fragments of information he'd gathered about each of the 5 men who had stolen his father from him. He knew the hunt would require patience, cunning, and ruthlessness. Carlos's death had, for years, been deemed a closed case by the authorities. The lack of concrete evidence and witnesses had led the police to drop the investigation, labeling it a tragic unsolved mystery. But Charles wasn't bound by the same constraints. He didn't need legal evidence, only an ironclad resolve. Over the years, Charles had secretly hired private investigators, slowly amassing information about each of the 5 men responsible for his father's death. He studied them relentlessly, memorizing every detail of their lives, learning their routines, and identifying their vulnerabilities. They were no longer strangers to him, but enemies, faceless villains who he knew intimately and who, in his mind, had become extensions of the evil that had ruined his life. The group of men who had taken his father's life was a motley crew, each with his own dark past. At the center was Mick Rios, the ringleader, a man known for his cold, ruthless ambition and ability to manipulate others. Mick was a former convict, hardened by years in prison and driven by a greed that knew no limits. His loyal henchmen, 4 men who had either been threatened or seduced by Mick's promise of wealth and power, each had their own sins, their own weaknesses. The first was Lucas Ortega, a lanky man with a penchant for gambling and a severe addiction to cocaine. He was easily swayed by promises of easy money and acted as Mick's right-hand man. Then there was Simon Slim Delgado, a wiry, jittery character whose specialty was intimidation. The third was Thomas Ruiz, a mechanic who had a record of assault but was fiercely loyal to Mick, seeing him as a means to escape his life of poverty. The last was Jose Montoya, a man who acted as the group's cleaner, often called in to cover their tracks. Jose was known for his ability to vanish and leave no trace, a talent that had kept him under the radar for years. Each man had a role to play that night, and each bore responsibility. Charles saw them as 5 pieces of a single monstrous entity. In his mind, they weren't individuals with lives or families of their own. They were merely extensions of the evil that had robbed him of his father. And to Charles, they had forfeited any right to mercy. Lucas Ortega, the weakest of the 5, became Charles's first target. A cocaine addict and gambler, Lucas had a routine that made him predictable. Charles learned his every move, watching him from afar, learning his weaknesses, and biding his time. On a cold, foggy night, Charles made his move. He followed Lucas as he staggered out of a bar, intoxicated and oblivious to the world around him. In the dark alley behind the bar, Charles struck. His approach was silent, his movements precise. Lucas never saw him coming. Within seconds, Charles had subdued him, his hands wrapped around Lucas's throat as he stared into his terrified eyes. "You remember Carlos de la Cruz?" Charles whispered, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Lucas's eyes widened, and he choked out a desperate plea. But Charles didn't listen. With one swift, final twist, he ended Lucas's life. The first of the 5 was dead, and Charles felt a strange calm settle over him. He had taken the first step toward avenging his father. He left Lucas's body in the alley, making sure no trace could be linked back to him. He had studied forensic methods, learning how to leave no evidence behind. The police would find a corpse, but they would find no clues. He vanished without a trace, becoming a ghost in a world that had once known him as Charles de la Cruz. The name, the legacy, the business, all of it was left behind. What remained was a man who had fulfilled a promise, a son who had avenged the father he loved more than anything. But vengeance comes with a price. Though Charles had extinguished the men who destroyed his family, he could not erase the darkness their actions had carved into his soul. Years passed. Whispers of the mysterious deaths spread throughout the criminal underworld. The police had no suspects, no leads, and no clear motive tying the murders together. Each scene was clean, methodical, and utterly perplexing. Investigators speculated about a vigilante, but without evidence, the cases grew cold. They became nothing more than chilling tales exchanged in hushed tones, warnings about an invisible hand that punished evil without mercy. Charles, now living under a new name in a quiet foreign village, often walked along the shoreline, the sea breeze brushing against his weathered face. To the locals, he was a quiet, polite foreigner who kept to himself. He taught English part-time, volunteered at a local orphanage, and lived simply. But behind his calm eyes lived the memory of Carlos de la Cruz and the lives Charles had taken in his name. He would sometimes stare out over the ocean and wonder, had he truly honored his father, or had he betrayed everything Carlos had ever stood for? Was justice truly served, or had he simply perpetuated the same cycle of violence his father had fought so hard to rise above? These questions haunted him, but he never shared them aloud. The world only knew the man he had become, not the journey that shaped him. One night, as the waves crashed softly beneath the moonlight, Charles visited a small shrine he had built in his modest home. There, beneath a single candle's glow, sat an old photograph of his father, smiling, alive, proud. Charles knelt and whispered, "I did it for you, Dad. I hope that wherever you are, you understand." A tear rolled down his cheek, not out of regret, but of remembrance. The war was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. But Charles knew, some wounds never truly heal. He stood up, extinguished the candle, and stepped into the night. Some stories end with peace, others with justice. But Charles de la Cruz's story ended with silence. This has been another episode on Unsolved Mystery Stories, where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind and the crimes that shock the world. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Until next time, stay safe.